One of the important things that Indigenous people look in this, the participation in the Green Climate Fund, is the full and effective participation of Indigenous people in related to all these climate finance issues. And we think it's essential, our participation there, especially because most of this discussion about process and climate action that are taken out are looking our territories, lands and resources as the base of this solution. So it's important to be in this space. I bring this example of this that show the importance of an effective participation of Indigenous people through all the GCF project cycle. It is the first funding proposal approved by the GCF board, and the name was Build the Resilience of Wetlands in the province of Daten del Marañón in Peru. And it was presented by this Peruvian Trust Fund for National Park and Protected Areas. This funding proposal have the objective to reduce deforestation and carbon emission in the Daten region, and focuses working with local government in 120 communities. Mostly of these are Indigenous communities. The project proposed strengthening the protected area established by the local government, as well as the creation of a new protected area. It also includes support for the development of land use and ecological zoning plan for the area and component of the community enterprise. In this case, the IRM, the independent redress mechanism of the fund, follow and conduct an investigation. In this case, they open a self-investigation. There was not a complaint for the communities or from any other. They start this investigation because they read different articles that were published by Tebtebba, by Forest People Program and RRI. And in this article, the concern about the funding proposal was about the lacking of clarity and how the project creation and consolidation of protected areas in this region will affect Indigenous people, ongoing effort to secure recognition of their traditional collective lands. Also, there was a high lack of information on Indigenous right to traditional lands and natural resources used in this project, because there was 120 communities and only 80 communities were under the FPIC. And most of when they talk about FPIC in this funding proposal, it was about socialization of the activities. And so they consult with 80 communities and 21 organizations. However, we think this consultation took only 2 weeks, and they appeared to be inconsistent in the number of community reported that had participated. Also, additional concerns were also raised regarding the lack of grievance mechanisms and the lack of a clear institutional role for Indigenous people in the project implementation. And furthermore, the way in which Profonampe handled the consultation has already generated tensions among and within Indigenous people organizations and risk the weakening Indigenous institution. And also, in these articles, there was this concern about if this funding proposal was misclassified, because it was classified like a funding proposal of category C, category that's supposed to have lower impact in people where this project will be implemented. So all these issues were like the trigger from the IRM, the independent redress mechanism, to initiate this preliminary inquiry. And this inquiry include they did review of the project approval documentation, they interview the GCF Secretariat. We have to remember the IRM is an independent body in the Green Climate Fund, so it's not inside the Secretariat. Most of this information, they review consent of the Federation that were part of the documentation, and also about these doubts about the categorization of the project. And they also make interviews with external stakeholders, with representatives of civil society, Indigenous people organization, also the people who draft these reports, the documents. And some points that came out in these interviews were that the consent should be both at the community level and also at federation level because of the Indigenous people way of organization in this area, and that they should have taken into account the local structure and of each community. And also, one of the concerns about this funding proposal is because the IRM is there. Anyone can access to IRM, anyone even online can go and post any concern if they have about a funding proposal. But one of the concerns is how these people in the area of Daten El Marañón in Peru are going to be able to access to this, because we know in indigenous territories there is a lack of access to internet, and these are really protected areas in Peru where the logistic and the facility to have access to this is difficult. So that was also one of the concerns. Also, there were some interviews that explained that some communities have taken steps in the past 10 years to pursue this collective title, and it was the concern that this project documentation did not state about this effort. And we know all these negative processes that have happened in Latin America and in other areas at global level about this definition of protected areas that are related to indigenous people, so that was also a concern. The other discussion about the category of the funding proposal, it was funding proposal that include indigenous people should be category C. Most of the discussion that should not be classified as category C because this will have important impact in indigenous people territories. The debate of this Peru project at the Green Climate Fund focused most on the procedural issues and the potential impact on the ground that could be significant in a region where indigenous people organizations and communities are claiming the right to land, territories, and resources, as well as their lifeline. In this case, we think that the Green Climate Fund will need to develop its own capacity to fully access and ensure compliance with international human rights standards and obligations relevant for indigenous people. And in order to be accountable and apply appropriate standards, the Profonampe experience has demonstrated the need for the GCF to adopt this strong policy on indigenous people, because there is the IP policy, but it needs to be fully implemented, because this also recognizes the relevance of international norms and obligations like we have in the UNDRIP. And the GCF should adopt the core FPIC standard and should also allow direct access to funding for indigenous people on project and climate initiative. We have recently seen that the stakeholder engagement plan is already defined, and it was published at the beginning of this year in March. We think to enable meaningful stakeholder participation in defining strategies and activities during the project implementation. So it's important to establish this guide to propose ways and mechanisms for the progressive involvement of stakeholders in the different activities of the project, with a focus on the full respect of indigenous people rights. We think it's important that the funding proposal should be more inclusive, and the Secretariat should take this into account. And also, when you have the whole funding proposal in the Secretariat, they should look for this inclusivity and participation actions in this concept note and also in the funding proposal. Most because we want to achieve that these funds go beyond doing no harm and to do good for indigenous people. That is also that we always raise, because we want that we have a meaningful participation in the whole project cycle, and especially when it have relation with our lands and territories. One of the most important things is that this process should be based on the rights, the cultural integrity, the self-determination of indigenous people, and the respect of FPIC.